Okay, I'm going to make a start. Hi everyone, and welcome to what is very sadly the last instalment in the Replatforming Deplatform Women series, hosted by the Cambridge Radical Feminists Network. My name's Phoebe Fuller, as you probably know, and I'm the co-president of the network and co-organiser of the lecture series. With me are my wonderful co-president and fellow organiser, Sophie Watson, and also our founder, Imogen Galilee. Excuse me. As usual, we have the brilliant Mary from Object, who's handling all of the tech. So if you notice any issues with that, please let Mary know and she'll try and sort it out. I know a lot of you will have been watching the whole lecture series, so you're used to the setup by now, but I'm just going to run through some basic housekeeping for those of you that are joining us for the first time. So for those of you that are with us on Zoom, if you could just ensure that when it comes to the Q&A, you ask any questions you have for the panelists using the Q&A function. On which you can find in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen, and not the chat function. It just means that all of your questions are in one place and they're much easier for me to keep track of, so I can get as many answered as possible. Do also feel free to use the chat to make comments and have conversations with one another. And as always, please do this politely so Mary isn't forced to Jackie Weaver anybody. Those of you joining us from YouTube, if you ask your questions in the comments on the live stream, Imogen will be keeping an eye on those and we'll get around to as many as we can. And just remember that YouTube is public, so make sure you don't include any personal information, as it can be seen after the live stream as well. And if you want to join in the conversation on Twitter, Sophie will be live tweeting the event under the hashtag CamRadFems. Just a couple of quick thank yous before I hand over to our panelists for this evening. Sophie and I owe a big thanks to the rest of the network for all of their help with organising this series, and a special shout out to Eve for the lovely posters and the promo material that you have seen online. And of course, a big thank you to Mary and to Object, as always, for lending us your platform and your time. We couldn't have done it without you. And lastly, thank you, our audience. When me and Sophie were organising the series, we expected maybe 50 to 100 participants for each of our talks. And in fact, all of our talks have been in excess of 700 people. We're just blown away at the response we've had, and we're so pleased that we've managed to reach so many people. You've all been really supportive on Twitter and in the comments, and I've received so many lovely emails. I'm sorry if I haven't had a chance to reply to all of them, but I promise you I do read them. Just thank you so much. We're really hoping that this will be an annual occurrence. While we obviously don't want there to be any more deplatformed women, unfortunately, it is the reality of the climate we currently live in, and we won't stop amplifying the voices of those who've been silenced until the message gets through to the people that are trying to silence them, that we're not going to stop meeting and we're not going to stop talking. They can't stop us from speaking. We'll always find ways to listen to each other and to be heard by one another, and hopefully people that disagree with us as well. We want to start this conversation. Now, unfortunately, as you probably know, the wonderful Selena Todd couldn't be with us this evening. We hope that she will join us at some point in the future. But luckily, we have the fantastic Dr. Heather Brunskell Evans, who's really helped us out by stepping in at the last minute. And we're sure that you'll enjoy her talk just as much. Heather is a philosopher and Foucault scholar who has a particular interest in feminist philosophy and the politics of the male and female body. Her latest book, Transgender Body Politics, analyses the political movement of transactivism in a broader sense, and it compellingly makes the case for what she calls a transgender empire, a form of patriarchy doing immense damage to women, which we must stand shoulder to shoulder against. She's the founder of WHRC, an organisation which aims to protect women's sex-based rights, and the co-author of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights as well. She was no platform from speaking at King's College London, and was also dismissed by the Women's Equality Party as a spokesperson after expressing her views on the medical transition of children. We're delighted to have her here tonight to speak about the erasure of the female body. Thank you so much for being here, Heather.
Thank you for inviting me. Okay. So I'd like to frame my presentation here in the context of George Orwell's novel 1984. As you know, the novel explores a dystopian future in which a totalitarian government led by Big Brother controls the actions, thoughts, and even the emotions of its citizens. I originally read it in 1984, and I didn't enjoy it, seeing it as too far-fetched. I didn't know at that point that one day I would cleave to the book's metaphors as ways of describing the current situation in which I have found myself for the past 6 years. The first sentence of the book says, "It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. So, since 2015, I've had multiple attempts at silencing me because I will not affirm there is a 13 o'clock. What is the 13 o'clock fact to which my intelligence says I will not submit? It's this. Biological sex is a social construction. Gender identity, in contrast, is inherent, almost soul-like, and is the true marker of whether one is male or female. Ergo, men who identify as women are not just people men who identify as women, they are women. Similarly, women who identify as men are men. And children exploring and experimenting with gender identities are the sex they claim to be. So in the interest of time, I give you just one example in detail of my experiences. So my first experience of the world tilting oddly on its axis with regard to truth was in 2015 when I worked at the University of Leicester as a senior research fellow. I wrote a commentary about the photograph of Bruce Jenner on the front cover of Vanity Fair, plus a feature article inside the magazine about Jenner's transition in late middle age to becoming a woman. And for those of you who can't recall the image or have never seen it, Jenner is wearing a basque which pinched in his waist and hid the lumpiness of his male genitals. He had already had a silicone breast implants and facial feminization surgery, and his large male hands were hidden behind his back and he was in a provocative pose. So what I wrote about was not so much Jenner, of whom I was indifferent and had no antipathy to his wanting to identify as female. But what I wrote about was the simulacrum of femininity and how it was presented as more real than female biological reality. This simulacrum was an absolutely fabricated product created by Jenner himself, the media machinery that promoted him, and the medical technology that had enabled him to perform femininity. It's too long to go into too much detail now, but there was an official complaint made about my article from a trans activist academic from the University of Goldsmiths. There was an attempt to silence me in my place of work, not only about what I could write about, but what I could think. I could not say, for example, that when Bruce Jenner was fathering children or winning an Olympic gold medal in the men's decathlon, that he was male. What I was compelled to say was that Bruce Jenner was female and had been female from birth. I could not talk about mine and other women's bodies and that biology matters. I could not talk about the social context in which our biologies lived. In other words, Jenner could legitimately speak about womanhood, but I could not. Apparently, Jenner, unlike all other mortals, had no psychological or social context for his lived gender or his choices. He just is female. I was accused by the complainant of committing a heinous moral crime by writing my article, of possibly breaking the law and making trans staff and students quake at the mere fact that I was an employee at the University of Leicester, even if I didn't teach them, and that they would be too frightened to go to work or to go to lectures. Ultimately, in this instance, the university protected me from accusations of wrongthink by getting their own lawyers involved and assessing whether I had, who assessed, in fact, they concluded, thankfully, that my article had made a positive contribution to gender theory. So it resolved itself after a number of days. But I learned a lesson from this incident. And the lesson was that I could be made frightened. And I was initially extremely frightened. Not only from my livelihood, but also I felt a fear of something amorphous, and I'm going to call that Big Brother. There was something going on about which I, at that moment in time in 2015, had been unaware, although there had been feminists writing about this, and in particular, I'm thinking of Donis Raymond, who wrote at the end of the 20th century, 1979, I think, a book called The Transgender Empire. So I experienced at that time what Foucault describes as a disciplinary panopticon, when the power to punish someone comes from a central source, but you can't quite work out where the power is coming from, but it watches you constantly so that people actually police themselves. And what I discovered through that incident, through people writing to me, through conversations that I had, that people were very frightened to speak out, and they applauded me for my bravery, but I hadn't even known at that point that I was being brave. So that was the incident that propelled me into the world which has preoccupied me ever since. So the point is, and I think for younger feminists, they need to grasp this, is that the Ministry of Truth has been a long time writing its manifesto. In the late 1980s, when I was at university, and in the early 1990s, when I was doing a PhD at Goldsmiths, in fact, any student, including myself, who dared to bring the female body and experience of that body into theory were slurred as biological essentialists. So the term transphobe hadn't been invented, but to be called a biological essentialist was basically to demonstrate how crude your thinking was, and that you were sort of a dinosaur that still had some bizarre notion that bodies mattered. So students at that time policed themselves against accusations of essentialism almost as rigorously as students today will police themselves against accusations of transphobia. The theory that underpinned erasure of the body was a version of post-structuralism as interpreted by Judith Butler, although she wasn't alone in doing so. But I think her book Gender Trouble is arguably the most influential text that problematizes the distinction between sex and gender. With regard to gender, she argues that the gendered body is performatively reproduced through stylized repetitive acts. It's not simply the case that social meanings are written onto a passive body, or that an individual chooses to perform, but rather that the gendered body is produced in and through taken for granted regulatory everyday practices. And I completely agree with her. It is because femininity, and indeed masculinity, is performative through the various ways we represent ourselves, that male-bodied Jenna could be viewed as female by an enthusiastic general public, and even voted by Glamour magazine as one of its 25 Glamour Women of the Year in 2015, because he performed femininity more successfully than most women actually perform it. But, I'm going back to Butler now, with regard to sex, I depart from her view and see it as wholly politicized. She argues that the ostensibly natural fact of sex is actually discursively produced by various scientific discourses in the services of heteronormative political and social interests. And that she urges us to contest the immutable character of sex. And if we do so, it will open up possibilities for human freedom, including that one may be born male, but become a woman. So a process has occurred in academia, building on post-structuralist and postmodern theorizing, which, combined with a militant transactivism, has then spread out and captured our institutions now in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. So, and Stonewall, as we know, has been particularly useful in working for the Ministry of Truth. Indeed, we can see Stonewall as one of the main architects of compelled newspeak. The price of having given up the female body has been catastrophic for women and for children. I then learned that I could not only could I not talk about women, I couldn't raise concerns about safeguarding children without being vilified. I could not say that behind the allegedly empirically existing transgender child, there is an ideology that we should explore as a culture. I could not say that our children deserve protection from harmful ideology. The Ministry of Truth describes safeguarding as evil bigotry and the sterilization of children as social progress. And I could, and we'll talk about this in questions maybe, tell you of the numerous occasions in which I was no platformed and frightened for my life on one occasion for saying such things. So in conclusion, here is my advice for anyone who is seeking it. You may not be, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. Since the one thing Big Brother becomes incensed about, completely incensed about, is any reference to women's or children's bodies. Notice men's bodies are always left alone. What we should do now as feminists is make a case for the absolute necessity of defining woman as an adult human female, and of wholeheartedly rejecting the idea of including male-bodied people into the category of woman. I'm delighted that more and more women and younger feminists now are resisting the panopticon and are now declaring also that there isn't a 13 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was, yeah, it said everything that needed to be said. It really, it reminds me that of sort of a quote that's oppressing women on the basis of their sex and then denying that sex is a meaningful concept. It's a form of gaslighting. It's like repeatedly kicking someone in the shins and then denying that they have any shins at all. So yeah, if people could ask some questions of Heather, that would be fabulous. I guess yeah, I have loads of questions, so I'll kick it off, and then you can all be typing your questions in the chat. I guess maybe could you expand a little bit more on the importance on the importance of defining the body in feminism? Why is it so important? Obviously we know, but if you could expand a bit more on that, that'd be great.
Well, I think we know. I'm going to say two things here. One thing I think in relation to the body is that the body has, for the past 30 years, as I've just described, been erased more and more and more and more. And what it's disabled women from being able to talk about without being accused of, in some sense, being a fundamentalist about the body. And of course, we must remember that actually women have been defined by their bodies for years and years and years. So it's important that
I think
we bring a social context to that. But the bodily experiences that we have are distinct from male body experiences. And this is important. It's not dehumanizing to talk about our bodies. It's humanizing. We live our humanity, men and women, through our bodies. That's the reality of it. And that's those kinds of conversations that we are almost forbidden from having. And I think we should begin to have them. And if I had any say in the matter, I would love to kick off that conversation. Now, the problem with that conversation is, and why people don't want to have it, is because they think that it will return us to the point at which, when we were second-class citizens or had less social status than men, it was always that argument or that political position was always based on the fact that somehow our bodies restricted our capacity for rational thought, or it stopped us from being able to be agents in the public domain, because somehow physically and constitutionally we weren't constitutionally able to do so. So it's a complex issue, but we do need to begin to talk about it. But apart from all of that, we know that whatever meaning that we make of the body, whatever that meaning is, we are actually targeted because we have a female body. Our sex bodies are lived in a political and social context. So exactly, it's your kicking the shin metaphor, as it were. We know that we are targeted because of our sex body, and yet we are supposed to not even think of ourselves as having a sex body. So it's a kind of cognitive dissonance which women are having to live with all the time.
Absolutely. I just want to plug Audre Lorde here, probably my favorite feminist thinker, who says, we recognize that all knowledge is mediated through the body, and that feeling is a profound source of information about our lives. It feels profoundly wrong that we are unable to talk about our oppression on the basis of which we're oppressed. So now we've got loads of great questions coming through. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. So this person says, what can we do as feminists to reintroduce the female body as a topic for conversation and activism in academia and beyond? And I guess I'd also be interested in the ways that we can do that without accusations of bioessentialism. Obviously that will happen, but how can we escape that? A similar question somebody says is, how do we best reply to those who say it doesn't matter if we say pregnant people with cervixes, etc.?
I'll come to the first one about bioessentialism. I think what we have to do is stop policing ourselves about this discussion. I think we're all afraid of having it in case we slip into something which could be seen as bioessentialism, but this prevents us from having the conversation. And let's forget about it. Let's just pursue it. I think it's something that we should pursue. I think it would be very exciting to have those kinds of discussions that were being had when Audre Lorde was writing. It would be great to go back into them. We will be accused of it, but we're accused of everything. I'm sure you're aware that you're talking to a Nazi at the moment. So I've stopped concerning myself with what I'm accused of, and it would be great to have that, for us all to have that freedom. What difference does it make if we use the term pregnant body, pregnant person? Well, for a start, I'd like us to recognize the fact it is only ever women that have to speak about their bodies in gender neutral terms. Men never have to speak about their body in gender neutral terms. So something political is going on in that very fact in and of itself. So if you speak about a pregnant person, what you're saying is that a man can be pregnant. And once you start getting into the idea that men can be pregnant or women can have penises. What you're doing is you're compounding the 1984 Newspeak. So I mean, I'm not going to explore it any more than that. I think it's important to return to the body, as I've just said. Yeah.
Absolutely. A bit more of a specific question from my co-president, actually. She's interested to know about the similarities between the accusations of bioessentialism in the 80s and of transphobia now. When did this shift sort of take place, and who were making those accusations while you were at university?
Right. The people who were making those accusations were the people who were very committed to the kind of theory that I'm also committed to. So they were made from people who were bowled over by post-structuralist ideas, postmodern ideas, and queer theory was just beginning. And queer theory initially seemed quite a good theoretical position to come from, because it was problematizing the ways in which our society is policed by heteronormativity. And all it seemed to be doing in its initial stages was developing a theory about that. It very quickly became something else. But to go back to the question, who was doing it? I found myself in the same situation then as I find myself in now. So I'm always slipping and sliding between two different forms of accusation. So from when I was doing a PhD using Foucault and radical feminism, comparing and contrasting their different ways of looking at sexuality, I would be accused by Foucauldians of being an essentialist, biological essentialist, because I was concerned to bring in radical feminist ideas. And from radical feminists, often I was accused of selling out to post-structuralism. And so my struggle, my personal struggle, has always been how to have a voice and not be policed about my desire to explore the consequences of bringing these ideas together. And what has happened is they've never been brought together. And all we've done by not bringing them together is the consequences of that is what we have now, where incrementally over a period of time, it has become possible not just the idea that sex is socially constructed, but that gender identity is inherent, is based on a prior premise and a hypothesis, and that is that there are no such things as women. In 1988, I think, Denise Riley wrote a book called something, Am I Not That Name? Something like that, in which she makes a case that there is not such a category as women. So the idea that women couldn't talk about themselves was happening throughout the 1980s. And in a sense, through the unintended consequence of what second wave feminists did, which was to separate sex from gender, which was a positive thing to do, because before then, slightly lecture mode here. The second wave feminist argument was, when sex and gender identity are seen to match each other, when gender identity axiomatically and automatically just comes from sex, then it makes women's position as inferior natural. It naturalizes women's inferiority. So what second wave feminism did, it asked us to conceptually separate sex from gender, which was fantastic. But as with all theories, there are unintended consequences to it. And the unintended consequence was that separation became something that people who were not feminists got a hold of and ran with the gender identity part of it, so that now with the your Carter principles. In 2004, there was an argument that, or 2006, there was an argument that gender identity was more important than sex, and that we should erase it from, we should bring gender identity into legal documents. But that had been built on a prior thing of the Gender Recognition Act 2004, in which for the first time you could actually have your legal sex, you could have a man's body and have your legal sex as female. So we need to go back over all of these incremental stages that happened, that in a sense, some feminists, not me, some feminists were onto this and I wasn't. I feel as if I was sort of slightly daydreaming into something, sleepwalking, I mean, into something. And the chickens have come home to roost. This is the consequence of it. So I've forgotten what the question was now.
Not to worry, that's fascinating, really fascinating. I've never really thought about it in that way before, as in sort of second wave feminism laying the grounds for some of this stuff. But I do want to go back to Foucault, because you've talked about it quite a bit. In what sense does he have a part to play in getting us out of this mess? Despite from what a lot of us see is being a large part of how we got into it, not to mention his myriad personal failings, including the recent claim and allegations of child abuse. So how can we use him to help us get ourselves out of this? Can we?
So you've just said something there that I want to respond to, but I think I best not, because if we go down the child abuse thing, which I'm not avoiding, we will concentrate on that, just to let people know that I'm talking with Benjamin Boyce about this next Monday, when I will talk about this in full. So I'm absolutely not avoiding it.
Fantastic. We'll leave a link to that in our description as well. So yeah, go ahead and watch that. I just wanted to bring it up because it felt like something important to address.
Absolutely fine. So I could frame it as, why would I want to use Foucault, given that I'm a feminist and not a liberal feminist, and that there are many other wonderful women scholars that I could be calling upon. Why would I call upon Foucault, one might ask? Well, what Foucault is particularly brilliant at, which I think is unique to him, is that he gives an explanation of how it is that we can experience ourselves completely and absolutely as a particular kind of subject and believe it absolutely fundamentally, and how that subjectivity can be socially constructed from beginning to end. So, for example, in my own thinking, I've used a Foucauldian analysis, for analysing the Tavistock, for example, how it is that clinicians who want to do, obviously, the best by young people, and how young people themselves can absolutely believe that social justice requires the clinician and the child to be sterilized. How has that happened? It's happened because the belief in a particular kind of transgender identity has become so real to people. It feels so fundamental to their sense of self that they believe that there is something which is a transgender identity. And that relationship between what Foucault would call knowledge, the specific knowledges that have brought us to this position, the power relations that have brought us to this position, and the kinds of ethics that have brought us to this position coalesce around subjective identities very, very powerfully. So I don't work with the idea that in some sense, that I was going to talk about false consciousness. I won't get into that but the idea that in some sense this has been imposed on people, it doesn't quite work for what is going on with transgenderism. I think that, for example, when I say that I don't believe that there's such a thing as a transgender child or a transgender adult, some people who identify as transgender feel that they're being erased. They're not just saying it, they actually experience it as being that they are being erased. And I'm sympathetic to that. I'm really sympathetic to that. Because if you feel that you've discovered the absolute truth of yourself, then for somebody to say that isn't true must be very disconcerting, very upsetting. Nevertheless, I think it is a fabrication. And I think that Foucault has a particular role in his methodology and his ideas in helping expose that.
Absolutely. I guess recently as well, we've seen Richard Dawkins very, very oddly being sort of castigated by humanists. It seems odd that an organization that purports to refute transubstantiation as an ideological dogma can be so captured by this thought that a person can change their sex simply by their thoughts alone. I guess a pertinent question to ask right now is somebody who wants to remain anonymous. Us clinicians who work in CAMS, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, are restricted / prevented from challenging the idea of a trans child. What advice would you give to those of us who are gender critical, need to keep our jobs, but are extremely concerned about safeguarding?
Right. I've thought long and hard about this. And when I and my colleague, Professor Michelle Moore, when we were initially doing research for our first book on transgender children, we actually interviewed some clinicians who spoke to us anonymously. I'm going back now to 2017, I think. And that was before the Tavistock JIDS had got the exposure that it had. So it was a different political context, actually. And they were very disturbed and frightened. So the panopticon was absolutely present there. And I was disturbed at that time, to be quite honest, because my faith was that clinicians would come from the position first do no harm. And it seemed to me at that point that if you felt so disturbed about what you were doing, that you would resign, that you must resign ethically, you must do so. And I feel much less hard about that now, or hard line about it. I understand this is such a complex thing. People have small children, they have mortgages. We're all clinicians too, human, and we're caught up in something which is so huge. I don't know how to answer the person who's just asked me the question, other than that I do know that clinicians are now, and psychotherapists and psychologists, are now joining hands together with each other and resisting this and doing so more publicly. And there are organizations which I know of, and I'm sure the person, him or herself, knows what they are, but if they don't, I can be contacted about them, where people are daring now to speak out. And of course, we've got the whole thing at the moment about conversion therapy and whether we're going to have a new law which would make it illegal to convert children or adults, when of course, it deprives children of their right. Some of the children are extremely disturbed, and I'm sure we all know this, and they have, it's part of our safeguarding and our ethical priority, that what we do is that we take the whole child and the context in which it's identifying as transgender and explore that with the child. This would be seen as conversion therapy. So we're at a quite an extreme impasse at the moment, but I'm very hopeful, because when I first started to think about this and talk about this, there were so few people talking about it. And I know that if I said something which now seems bog standardly nothing, like, children should, if adults want to identify as the other sex when they're adults, if people want to identify as the other sex when they're adults and have medical treatment and so on, thank goodness we live in a country in which that's possible. But that children should their bodies should be protected until they're adults and they're developmentally and psychologically immature, and that they're not capable of making those kinds of decisions for themselves. Well, I can say that now without too much furore going on around me, but I can tell you in 2017 and 2018, when I was saying this, the reaction to that was unbelievable. I mean, I'd never known anything like it in my life. So it was as if I was making an argument, and this is where the 1984 comes into it. I was making an argument for safeguarding, and it was as if I was saying, let's murder little children. It was so extreme, the response. Yeah. So we have to collectively, I think at some point in the future, there will be a reckoning of how this all came to pass, and I hope that have contributed to that eventual reckoning. But that I say this over and over again. I used to be frightened, and I still obviously am frightened in some circumstances, but on the whole, I'm not frightened very much anymore about any of this. So the thing that is the worst thing is to let fear grab you. And I think there are enough people now who are standing against this transgendering of children that it's possible for clinicians to speak out now. But maybe not. I don't know which institution this person is at or whatever.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. The scariest part of speaking about this stuff is the thought of speaking about this stuff. In my experience, I'd say approach that with caution. I myself have had, rape threats, death threats, etc. It's not pleasant, but when the alternative is giving up all of women's rights that we fought for and completely surrendering children to invasive and harmful medical procedures on the basis of metaphysical idealism, it's hard not to speak up.
It is hard not to speak up, but just one more thing here. I think that what I've come to value about all of this after the past 5 to 6 years is that I actually can live with myself. And that's a huge gift. If I'd seen it and turned the other way, my life would have been much pleasanter, no doubt, and much more easy. But some part of me I think some part of one has to die actually in order to see, but not to see. So yeah, I can live with myself, which is.
Yeah, sometimes I wish I could take what some would call the blue pill again. Somebody's asked who is behind this panopticon, if you'd call it that. From where or whom is the fear coming? What is driving the fear that fuels the silencing? And has it feel like a manipulation to turn feminist theory against women and erase the female body? Who's driving this? I guess is the question.
Well, I think there are drivers, and I think, if you want to read Jennifer Bilek, she's very good on the money behind all of this and the political interests that are behind all of this. I mean, so we have to join various dots together. One of them is Big Pharma, absolutely. The politically invested interests of people who one might think of as being misogynistic, and who actually feel quite threatened by women's possession of their own bodies. I've often thought that Freud got it wrong, and that actually what is being exposed is not so much that women have penis envy, but that men have, I don't know what they have, vagina envy, clitoris envy, or envy of the female, the potential of the female body. So it is very strange that the moment at which women have allegedly got more rights than they ever have and more freedoms is the very, very moment that they are being undercut by a very misogynistic, what seems to be a male rights movement. So I think the constellation of all of these different factors has ended up with a big brother situation, or a panopticon situation, in which it is difficult to know who's driving it, but it is clearly being driven, and it's clearly being driven by fear. And the amount of self-policing that goes on in relation to this topic is mammoth. It's enormous. And all I can say is that we have got far more chance of knowing who the driver is if we start to try to relinquish some of our fear, speak out, because Big Brother can only remain in the shadows if we allow him to remain in the shadows. I have to say that there are some women drivers of this ideology as well. I'm not making it a black and white thing of men as a class oppressing women as a class. There are women who are mobilizing this discourse, some very prominent women who are mobilizing it, but nevertheless it is structured around a class divide, where it's the people who are being threatened are women. I mean, and as I keep saying over and over again, men are simply not threatened by a woman who claims to be male going into his changing room. He simply isn't. And nobody is asking a man to call himself a prostate holder.
Yeah, it's always women that have to change our language. And it seems like a lot of men don't quite understand as well. I was having a conversation with somebody who said, why do you care? You're only gonna go for a pee. And I was like, actually no, it's not just that. I sometimes, women will empty their menstrual cups in the sinks of the toilet, and the sort of look of horror and disgust at this mere mention of the female body. Question from somebody else, I guess, which you've sort of already answered, but maybe good to get your thoughts on it a little bit more. How, in your view, did we get from the social construction and stereotype of gender needing to change to people needing to adjust their bodies and identities to fit the stereotype? It seems like it all happened so quickly for such a dramatic shift.
I'm not quite understanding that question, actually.
Let me have another little look. So I guess, how did we get from this idea that gender sort of constrains us, and actually we can do, despite our sex bodies, we can inhabit any number of different, hobbies, clothing, anything, but it doesn't, and it's just a stereotype to this idea that we need to adapt our body and identity to fit in with the stereotype of what different sexes, quote unquote, like.
Right. I'm still not understanding it in the sense that I think that we've always adapted our bodies and conformed to gender stereotypes. That's not a new thing. I think it's more rigid now in many ways than it was in before, in various historical periods, actually. But that's another thing. I think what the questioner might be asking is, how did we go from wanting to rid ourselves from the straitjacket of gender to wanting to claim the straitjacketed gender and say that it's our liberation. How did that happen?
That's a way more eloquent way of putting it, and that's probably the question they were asking.
So if we go back, just allow me to be a conspiracy theorist for the moment. If we take the view that men would quite like to be women for all sorts of reasons, I mean, one of them just ridiculous, appallingly immoral, as far as I'm concerned, competing in women's sports, for example, when you can become a shining star or Olympic gold medalist if you say you're female rather than a second-rate male athlete. But those things aside, I think that for whatever reason that men want to claim to be women, there has to be made an argument that gender identity is inherent. So there are two cognitively dissonant things going on here. On the one hand, there's a claim that this is about gender diversity, and we can all choose to be fluid, and nowadays we can, be what we want. But in fact, what's happened is that it's become more concretized, more solidified, the idea of whether you're male or female, because now, of course, as we're talking about, you can be female inside a male body. Now, in order to make that claim, you have to say that there is something that it's metaphysical almost, that gender isn't a social construct. It may be a social construct. People who claim that they have a gendered soul will also agree that there are gender stereotypes, but they will say they recognize that, but for them, they're not part of that gender stereotyping, but because for them, they really do have something which they've had forever, since they were 3, since they came out of their mother's womb, even if they've competed, even like Bruce Jenner, for example, even if they're fathers and grandfathers, somehow they've been female all of their lives. In order to make that ridiculous claim, you have to say that there is some part of gender identity which is prediscursive, which has nothing to do with social context, which just somehow is. It's never quite explained where it is, but it's somehow located in the body. Like if we used to believe in, most people don't any longer believe in a religious soul, that part of God was in us somewhere as a soul. So I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I think what the questioner has pointed out is the ridiculousness that we can hold two things together at the same time, which is that gender is something that's socially constructed, and at the same time that there is a gender which is inherent, and somehow we're living with that contradiction. So, trans lobby groups like Gendered Intelligence, for example, makes if you read what they say, makes those claims all the time that trans children are real, but there are however many genders there are, and they never explain how it is that these different genders are so real that they're inherent. There's never an explanation for it. Let's keep talking about it and exposing the ridiculousness of it. I mean, just at the level of the intellect, we're being asked to give up our rational thought.
Yeah, it's like coming back to 1984. It's like doublethink. You're being asked to believe that gender is something that's innate to somebody, but also something which is a social construct. It doesn't marry together. I'll never forget telling somebody that I didn't have a gender identity, that I didn't believe in gender identity, and I'm saying, oh, so you're agender? No. I simply do not have gender identity. I have a sex, and I have a personality, and those things are separate. We're getting loads of really. Sorry, go on.
I think that what we need to do, actually, if we were, I'm seeing this. I'm very excited by this conversation, by the way, because I'm getting a feeling that we're almost ready to move on, not us now in this context, but culturally, as feminists, we're all ready to move on to another conversation or another set of ideas, which is just about to happen. So in that, what I was going to say to you, I do think that the idea that we don't have a gender identity is a little bit avoiding an issue. And the issue I think it's avoiding is the following one. I don't think that I have a gender identity in the way that a trans activist would talk about gender identity, you know, the gendered soul. But I do think that we are, and I'm being a Butlerian at this point, following Judith Butler's argument, that in a sense that we all are performing our gender all the time. So, for example, here, you and I are here with our long hair. I don't know whether you have makeup on or whether you don't, but there is some way in which gender is a language and we are all in relation to it constantly. So, and men too. And the reason why men don't wear skirts, presumably, is because they're policing themselves in relation to what it is to perform masculinity. So I think we need to recognize that we are performing femininity and masculinity, but it doesn't then mean that by doing so, that we are saying there's something inherent about that, rather than that, as human beings, we live in systems of meaning and symbolism. And this is one of them. It is a language. Gender is a language, which is taking me back to the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, when these ideas were very exciting, and then they became ossified, rigidified, and politicized into what we have now. Has that made any sense?
It makes perfect sense, yeah. Perfect sense. Right, let me just have a look. There's so many questions and they're all fab. I'm just having a quick glance through them. So I think we'll end on this one, as a lot of them are just sort of going over stuff that Heber's already talked about, and I'm conscious of the time. Says, the prevalent idea now seems to be that any subjective experience is as valid as any other. How do you argue against this? And I guess a little tag on from me, and what keeps you going, and can you end us on a positive note of some hope for the future?
The thing about the subjective experiences, I mean, there are two things to say to that. Only some subjective experiences are given value. If I say, or if women say that they don't want men in their toilets, and it's not because it's because of their subjective experience and that we learn from being a small child that some men are invasive and some men are sexually abusive. And it's not to say that all men are, or that every a man who identifies as a woman is going to be sexually or physically threatening. It's just that our experience tells us that, our lived experience tells us that we have to be very careful in the presence of men. So we police ourselves about where we go at night in the dark and so on. And this is out of men's experiences, which is why your friend couldn't get why it was that you were too bothered about somebody coming into your toilet, because for him, he'd not had that lifelong experience and so couldn't identify with it. So in that sense, experience is very important, but experience has to be a sort of collective experience. It can't just be based on what one person thinks. And what we've done with the transgender debate is that the very few people who are actually identifying as the other sex in our country, our laws, our social policies, our education policies, are all changing in relation to honoring the experience of somebody who believes intensely that they're actually transgender. So experience always has to be put into a larger context in which we can think about it and analyze it. So that's one thing. Ending on a positive note. All I can say is that I personally am feeling hugely positive, and I'm feeling really, this isn't because you've asked me to end on a positive note. It's because I'm actually feeling positive, because the political climate is changing so quickly. So 5 years ago, I keep talking about 5 years ago, it was so different. It was petrifying to speak out. Now, the fact that you are platforming women who've been deplatformed, that young feminists now who are taught. I mean, I can remember this, sorry, I'm going on a bit, I know we should end. The unintended consequences of what women asked for, which was sexual liberation in the second wave feminists, became utilized by the pornography industry, for example. So then what happened is that young women became absolutely petrified of feminists as being these sort of anti-sex people who moralistic, when in fact it had actually been the reverse. So there was a point at which young women would never have identified with feminists. And now it's very exciting to me that young women are beginning to revisit feminism for themselves, because they can see the consequences of not having a feminist language and a feminist discourse and feminist comrades. So I can sense in the culture something building up. And my answer to furthering is, keep on talking, keep on speaking out, and lose your fear. It's great. And that is happening. It's visibly happening. So that's it.
That's fantastic. I'm going to end what I've got to say on a quote by Andrew Dworkin. Many women, I think, resist feminism because it is an agony to be fully conscious of the brutal misogyny which permeates culture, society, and all personal relationships. Absolutely. So thank you so much, Heather. That was fascinating. I'm going to hand over to Sophie now, who's just going to say a few words about the series.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. And thank you so much, Heather. That was a brilliant way to end the series, and a tremendously nuanced way as well, which is very in keeping in what we've been trying to do over the last few weeks. And everyone, if you want to hear more from Heather, as she said, she's being interviewed by Benjamin Boyce, I think next Monday, the 26th, on how she reconciles her Foucault scholarship with her robust opposition to queer theory. So we'll put a link to that in the description. So as Phoebe said, before we end, as this is the last time, we just wanted to take a moment really to reflect on what we've achieved and also update you on what we're planning next. And in terms of what we've all achieved together, we've replatformed 6 brilliant women working across a range of sectors and discipline, from journalism, art and law to criminology, philosophy and social theory. We've also produced 6 lectures given by experts in their field, which we hope will be almost an introduction or an educational resource for women and indeed men who are interested in venturing off the beaten track a bit and exploring this kind of different thinking about feminism and free speech and academic freedom. The recordings will be up on YouTube indefinitely, so we hope you'll enjoy them all at your leisure. Yeah, the conversation about this stuff is usually so heated and often hopelessly muddled. So it's been an absolute joy to see that if you give people a space to have these conversations, they will come and have them in a really productive and thoughtful way. It's been really heartening for all of us, I think, to see you all talking in the chat and on YouTube and in the Q&A for the past 2 months. It's been fantastic. The slides not for this event, but for the events where we've had slides, will be uploaded to a single Google Drive. And there will also be a replatforming deplatformed women further reading list, hopefully, if I can organize myself. I'll try and pull together some links and PDFs in case you want to explore the texts that have come up or the ideas that each speaker has mentioned. So we'll link that in the description and probably put it out on socials as well as soon as both of those are ready. By way of some bonus materials, if like me, you're kind of sad that this is coming to an end, I'm also going to have a chat with the absolutely indomitable Sal Grover, who's the CEO of Giggle, about her experiences of setting up what seems to be the only female social and dating app on the internet. And that will be at some point in the next couple of weeks, and we'll upload it to our YouTube as soon as we can afterwards. So just keep an eye out for that and on our socials if you're interested. It's also worth saying that we've raised a slightly terrifying amount of money for CamRadFems and for CRFN. You're welcome to keep giving us money, but I think the first thing we wanted to say is thank you for trusting us the way you have to put it to good use, and you won't be disappointed. We do think you deserve to know what we're gonna be doing with it all, so we'll keep you posted. The main thing I think that this money is going to do is it's really liberated us from having to depend on the student union and other kind of institutions that are very policy captured within Cambridge. So we'll be able to run events and not worry too much about kind of booking room fees and fees for like online platforms and everything. So you will hear lots more from us because of your contributions. And we'll also hopefully be doing several kind of smaller projects, like, for example, funding the creation of a feminist community library here in Cambridge. We've noticed that many classic RadFem texts are surprisingly hard to get hold of, given that Cambridge is a city with over 116 libraries in the university alone. Interestingly, Judith Butler is coming out of our ears, but Andrea Dworkin is quite thin on the ground. So we'll try and redress that balance a bit. So yeah, that's really the thing to say about that is just a big thank you. And please just know that we will be investing your donations back into this feminist community in the form of events and resources and everything else whenever we can. As Phoebe said at the start, the lecture series will be an annual event, so we hope. We hope that you'll come back next year. God knows there's no shortage of harassed and no platformed women. I can't envision us running out anytime soon, unfortunately. It's late April now, so most of us will be tied up with revision and exams a little bit over the next few weeks, but we do have lots of stuff planned for the summer. And obviously it's one thing for us to say that we're going to take a break. It's quite hard to stay quiet when so much is going on with this stuff in the world. So maybe we won't take so much of a break after all. You'll have to see. And if you're in Cambridge, please get in touch and we'll invite you to one of our pub nights, because that's one thing that definitely won't be going on hold. I think the other big thing is, if you'd like help in any way, setting up your own replatforming event or starting your own feminist network, or if you're part of an existing group that would like to collaborate on some kind of event, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. It doesn't matter how busy we are, we will find time to have a chat with you. We want to make links with as many different feminist groups and individuals as possible. We're CamRadFems on Twitter, as hopefully you all know, and obviously we're also on YouTube and Facebook, where you'll be able to find us. I think, last of all, I just want to take this opportunity to share some quite exciting news. And that's that Phoebe and I are teaming up with Nicole Jones at Edinburgh and Saoirse Connolly at the National University of Ireland, Galway, along with a few other brilliant young women, to relaunch the XX network this coming summer. You might know Saoirse and Nicole for their feminist and free speech advocacy on their respective campuses, while XX is a youth-led, hopefully international network committed to a free speech approach to women's liberation, particularly in academia and on campuses. We'll be launching over the summer, so there'll be lots more details to follow. Phoebe and I were really lucky in that when we got to Cambridge, there was already a space set up for us to discuss women's issues and seek support and advice from other feminists, particularly wiser, more experienced feminists. And that's all thanks to Imogen Galilee, our founder, who you'll know from previous lecture events, because she founded the CamRadFems back in 2018. But we know that not everyone is quite so lucky. So if you're one of those people who aren't so lucky, and you're a student or a young person feeling isolated on campus in the face of gender ideology and the sex workers' work lobby and the student union or whatever else, we are organising, and both as the Cambridge Radical Feminist Network and hopefully as XX Network over the next few months, we're here and we have your back. So that's what we're all doing it for. That's about it from me. I think I kicked this lecture series off 6 weeks ago with a quote from a Cambridge suffragist called Millicent Fawcett, and my co-president has ended it with an equally brilliant and resonant quote from Andrea Dworkin. I think I'd like to repeat the Millicent Fawcett one, because it feels so relevant, even more relevant now, 6 weeks after we began this, than it did at the start. And that's that courage calls to courage everywhere, and its voice cannot be denied. So I think you're all evidence of that. And I guess unless anyone else has anything they'd like to add, then that's probably a good note to end on. So Mary, if you'd like to close the Zoom, go ahead.
I won't go quite as far as to say I incite this meeting to rebellion. But
it's implied.
I'd just like to say, if anybody, it's implied, it's in the foretext. If anybody is watching and is a student at Cambridge, please do get involved in Cambridge Radical Feminist Network. Part of the reason why I've agreed to help with XX, the relaunching, is because I'm going to miss Sophie so very much when she leaves, and I'm of course Imogen too. We're always going to be a space to support feminist students in Cambridge, so please do get in touch. And yeah, we follow our socials, and hopefully we'll have lots more exciting things soon. When I don't have 5 essay deadlines, I'll be a lot more busy. So thank you everyone. Mary, if you want to close down the Zoom, that would be fantastic, but thank you so much for all your support.